Imagine this. It's 1945. Berlin is nothing but rubble. And outside a concrete bunker, Soviet soldiers find a burned corpse. It's the remains of the man who started the world's deadliest war and masterminded the murder of 6 million people. But here's the thing. This man wasn't born a monster. He was a kid once, a struggling artist, even a decorated soldier. So how does someone so, well, unremarkable become the architect of a global catastrophe? That's the really disturbing question we're going to try and unpack in this explainer. So, to figure this out, we're going to trace his journey step by step. We'll start with his early days, see how he rose up from the chaos after World War I, watch how he grabbed power, and the disaster that followed. And finally, we'll look at the warning his story leaves for all of us. Adolf Hitler's childhood was complicated. It really set the stage for the man he'd become. His father, Alois, was a rigid, authoritarian guy who ruled the house with an iron fist. But his mother, Clara, who had already lost 3 children, was the complete opposite. Gentle, doting, maybe a little too overprotective. So you have this home environment of both brutal discipline and, suffocating affection. And what's wild is this colossal gap between who he thought he was and who he actually was. He saw himself as this great artist, right? But he got rejected from art school. Twice. He imagined himself a grand architect. But in reality, he was homeless, literally sleeping on park benches. This so-called cultural visionary was scraping by painting cheap postcards just to eat. That kind of failure, it doesn't just go away. It festers into a really deep resentment. Then, in 1914, World War I breaks out, and for Hitler, it was a lifeline. This aimless, failed artist finally found something that peacetime could never offer him: a purpose, a uniform, a feeling that he belonged. The army gave him structure, and for the first time ever, some recognition. He was even decorated twice for bravery. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a fanatic.
This quote, this captures the exact moment everything changed. He's in a military hospital recovering from a gas attack, and he hears that Germany has surrendered. The shock was so profound, he claimed it made him temporarily blind. But the key thing here, what the quote tells us, is that he wasn't crying for the millions of dead. He was crying because the German Empire had lost. Right there in that hospital bed, he decided what he was going to do with his life. Get revenge on the November criminals he blamed for the defeat. The failed artist had found a new mission.
So after the war, he's back in Munich, which is in total chaos. He's still in the army, and they send him to spy on this tiny little political group. And it's there that he discovers his real talent. It wasn't painting, it was speaking. He could paint pictures with his words that got crowds fired up. His speeches would start quiet and then build into this crescendo of rage. And with his voice, he turned that tiny German Workers' Party into the Nazi Party. In 1923, he got impatient. He tried to seize power by force in what's known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It was a complete disaster. He was arrested, thrown in prison. But that failure taught him a massive lesson, one he laid out in his book, Mein Kampf. As you can see, his new game plan had 3 parts. 1, no more violent revolutions. 2, and this is the really chilling part, use democracy to destroy democracy. And 3, build a massive movement using propaganda. This change in strategy would be the death knell for Germany's young republic. For most of the 1920s, while Germany's economy was doing okay, the Nazis were just a fringe party. But then, the 1929 Wall Street crash happened. The Great Depression slammed into Germany. Unemployment skyrocketed to 6 million people. And into that chaos and absolute desperation walks Hitler. Suddenly, he's not some extremist crank anymore. He's a guy promising simple answers and a return to greatness. And just look at how fast democracy crumbled. The speed is absolutely breathtaking. January 30th, 1933, conservative politicians who think they're smart enough to control him convince the president to make Hitler chancellor. Less than a month later, the Reichstag, the parliament building, burns down. Hitler uses it as the perfect excuse to suspend all basic rights. By March, the Enabling Act basically makes him a legal dictator. Then in 1934, President Hindenburg dies, and Hitler just merges the 2 jobs. Just like that, in 18 months, democracy was completely gone. And at the heart of this new dictatorship was this idea called the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. It meant the rule of law was gone, replaced entirely by the will of one man. Hitler's word was the law. For a country that felt humiliated and was broken by economic collapse, this offered a twisted kind of order. It allowed millions to pour all their hopes and fears into one all-powerful leader.
The power was completely personalized. Okay, so with total control at home, Hitler looks abroad. And he plays this brilliant, terrifying game. He mixes aggression with lies and deception. He sends troops back into the Rhineland. He annexes Austria. He takes over Czechoslovakia. And all the while, other countries, who are desperate to avoid another war, just let him do it. But his ambition had no limits. On September 1st, 1939, he invaded Poland, and Europe was plunged back into a world war. But this wasn't just a regular war for territory. It was driven by a core Nazi idea called Lebensraum, which means living space. The plan was to conquer Eastern Europe and then enslave or just flat out exterminate the Slavic people living there, who they saw as inferior, to create a giant German empire. This meant the war in the East was, from day one, a brutal war of racial annihilation. And the ultimate results of that racial ideology was the Holocaust, the systematic, industrial-scale murder of 6 million European Jews. The total human cost of the war he started it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Around 40 million Europeans dead, an entire continent left in ruins. And all of it grew from the resentments of that one failed artist in Vienna. By 1945, everything came crashing down. Soviet artillery is pounding Berlin to dust, and Hitler is hiding deep underground in his bunker. It's this surreal little world where he spent his last days, moving imaginary armies around on a map, screaming about betrayal, while the 1,000-year Reich he promised was being reduced to a 12-year nightmare right above his head. On April 30th, 1945, he killed himself. The legacy he left behind was just utter destruction. A ruined and divided Germany, a continent in shambles, tens of millions dead, and a world changed forever by his evil. I mean, the response to his actions gave us things like the United Nations and the nuclear age, but most of all, it left us with this permanent, essential warning about how fragile democracy really is. And this quote here really gets to the heart of why we still have to talk about this. The generation that actually lived through these events is passing away. Their experiences are turning from living memory into something we just read about in history books. And because of that, the warning that Hitler represents isn't getting less relevant. It's actually becoming more relevant for us to actively understand and remember. So, we end up right back where we started, but this time the question is for all of us. Understanding how a society can collapse, how hate can be turned into a political weapon, and how one person can lead a modern civilized nation into absolute barbarism, that's not just history. It's a lesson we have to carry with us, always. So, from this whole story, what is the one thing you think we must never, ever forget?